Good morning, History 105. I received quite a few emails about a discussion and review meeting, and I have decided to do one. I believe I will set up a synchronous meeting for tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. It will be recorded, and I will post the link to the recording. So those of you who are not available at 3 o'clock this afternoon will still have the benefit of listening to the discussion and review. I'm going to send you an email tonight, and I'm going to raise some questions about the material that we've covered, some questions for you to think about. And these are matters that perhaps we can focus on in our discussion and review tomorrow. But you need to come prepared to ask some questions. I am not going to do a review session where I summarize the relevant information in a period of about an hour, where you just sit and listen and take a new set of notes. I'm not going to do that. I am again. I will present you. I'll send a class email out later today with some questions, some matters for you to think about, sort of big picture themes and topics concerning each of the major subjects that we have covered. Anyway, I have decided to do a discussion and review session. I want to talk about what the lecture outline refers to as the social and cultural dynamics of the American Revolution, which means a couple of things. First of all, we're going to talk about Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence, and we're going to look at the experience of the American Revolution for certain groups of ordinary people. Excuse me. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the actual fighting of the War of Independence itself. But I want to begin with Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Remember last time toward the end of lecture, I was emphasizing that Americans' march to independence did not take place overnight. It's not as if Americans got up one morning and said, hey, how about independence? The march toward independence, as I'm calling it, is really a process that takes place over the years from 1765 to 1776. So that's an 11-year period. I indicated that there were a couple of major steps, major events that occur during those 11 years, which push Americans toward independence. We covered two of those steps yesterday. We talked about 1765, when Americans decided that while Parliament had some central authority over the general affairs of America, Parliament did not have local authority within the colonies themselves. Step two came in 1774 with the First Continental Congress, when America decides that Parliament has no authority over America, no authority at all, no general authority over such matters as regulating trade and commerce, managing the money supply and the postal system, no such general authority, and certainly not local authority. When the delegates at the First Continental Congress repudiated, period, Parliament's authority over and in America, there was only one connection. There was only one tie that still bound America to England, and that was King George III. For the next 2 years, from September of 1774 until July of 1776, Americans continued to profess allegiance to King George III. So the third step on the road to independence would be repudiation of King George III. The repudiation of King George III began with Thomas Paine and his famous pamphlet, Common Sense, which was published in newspapers throughout the colonies in January of 1776. Paine was a recent immigrant to America. He had come the previous fall. He had been invited by Benjamin Franklin to come to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Paine, by occupation, was a corset maker, a dressmaker. He's fancied himself as a sort of pedestrian intellectual, and he is going to write this pamphlet, Common Sense, which was aimed at mobilizing popular support for American independence. At this time, active support for independence may have been supported by as few as 20% of the colonists. So there was a lot of work to be done. Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, is going to be directed at ordinary people. He is not trying to speak to elites. This is not aimed at Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Patrick Henry. It is aimed at ordinary people. And again, Paine is making the case for American independence. Before he could argue independence, he had to knock down the proposal for reconciliation. What did reconciliation mean? Well, there were a lot of Americans who were afraid of independence. They thought it was too bold, too radical a step. Instead, they hoped to patch up the relationship with England. Perhaps that relationship could be returned to what it had been before 1763, when there had been a long period of salutary neglect, when the empire operated as a federal system, which I explained last time, meaning that there were two sources of authority. There was a center and a periphery. Parliament was the superintending legislature and had authority over the general affairs of the empire, over those matters of common interest and concern for everyone living in the empire. But there was local authority as well. Each of the member states had their own legislature, and the way this federal system worked was that Parliament stayed out of local affairs. Parliament did not intervene in local affairs. So this idea of reconciliation meant that maybe the old relationship that had prevailed before 1763 could be restored. Paine's first job was to knock down the appeal that reconciliation had for a lot of American colonists. And he did this, first of all, by pointing out, reminding Americans that a shooting war had already started. The War of Independence had begun in earnest with the battles of Lexington and Concord and Breed's Hill in the spring and summer of 1775. I argued yesterday that an armed insurgency had actually developed fully a year before. So Paine is saying the war is already on. Therefore, we can't go back. Reconciliation as appealing as that idea might be, is no longer feasible. Paine also argued that America was ready for independence. It had enough people and resources. He pointed out how much larger in expanse America was and asked why a continent, America, should be governed by an island, Great Britain. He also attacked the institution of monarchy. He attacked King George III. Remember, this was the only tie that still kept America part of Britain. So he attacks the institution of monarchy. He's attacking George III. He says that monarchy was a bad system. It was based on human inequality. It was a system that had left, in his words, the world in blood and ashes. He also employed a biblical argument against monarchy. He attacked the English Constitution and the English system of governance as being good in theory, but far too complicated in practice. He called for Americans to repudiate monarchy, to repudiate the king, to declare independence, and to set up republics throughout America. A republic for Paine and for most Americans was a system of popular self-government without a king. Paine also expressed themes of American exceptionalism. I've already talked about American exceptionalism, particularly in connection with John Winthrop and the Puritans' shining city on the hill. I told you that exceptionalism was a way of thinking that was interwoven throughout American history. American exceptionalism emphasized that America was a special nation, perhaps God's nation, and that Americans were a special people, perhaps a chosen people. Along these lines, Paine said that the struggle for American independence, in his words, would mark the birthday of the world, and that the American struggle for independence, particularly if it was successful, would result in Americans having an opportunity to start human history all over again. Wow, those are big ideas and big expectations. Paine's pamphlet, I think, did its work. I think it helped to prepare Americans for independence that was declared just 6 months later. Of course, Independence Day, July the 4th, the issuance of the American Declaration of Independence. I want to talk a bit about the Declaration of Independence, and let me read the opening paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as through them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then the Declaration of Independence proceeds to list all of the abuses and acts of tyranny committed by George III. The paragraph which I just read to you is one of the most pithy statements of essential American principles that has ever been written. Jefferson, first of all, points out that all men enjoy natural rights. What are natural rights? Well, he says specifically life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But natural rights differed from the earlier arguments that Americans had appealed to, the rights of Englishmen. We talked about the rights of Englishmen to be politically represented, no taxation without representation, the right of a person to be protected from arbitrary arrest and confinement, and protection against seizure of private property. These were the historic rights of Englishmen to which Americans appealed in 1765. But 11 years later, Jefferson is now talking not about the rights of Englishmen. He's talking about natural rights. Natural rights are given by God. And as such, they cannot be taken away by any earthly authority. The English had believed that that government was sovereign, and that government, that a constitution was a charter of power, and that government gave certain rights to its people. What Jefferson is arguing here is quite different. He's saying that rights are natural; they are either given by God or they are simply inherent in being a human being. And he's saying that rights do not come from government. Rights do not come from government. He's arguing that government is not sovereign, rather, the people are sovereign. He says that legitimate government is government that is based on the consent of the governed, on the consent of the people. That government is literally a compact, an agreement, an arrangement between government and the people, that at all times government is answerable and accountable to the people. And when government fails to perform the duties, when it fails to protect the people, to uphold and protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that a free people have a right and perhaps a God-given duty to alter and abolish that government and to institute new government that will be responsible and accountable and answerable to the people. When you look at the Declaration of Independence as a whole, it is certainly based on a deep distrust of executive authority. In this case, the executive authority of George III had become absolute tyranny. And there's one other interesting fact about the Declaration of Independence, which has often been lost on Americans as they take time to read their Declaration of Independence, or when they celebrate Independence Day on July the 4th. And this has to do with the fact that the Declaration of Independence did not establish a single unified nation. Rather, it established 13 different distinct nations, 13 distinct little republics. So the Declaration of Independence acknowledged the creation of what might be called a plural nation. The United States of America was often described in using a plural verb. In other words, the United States are, the United States are, the United States constituted a confederation of independent states. The language of the United States is viewing the United States as a unified nation. That language did not really become popular until after the American Civil War. The Declaration of Independence finished America's march to independence. This was a march to independence that occurred over a period of 11 years, from 1765 to 1776. And this march to independence had occurred in 3 distinct steps: 1765, 1774, and then 1776. This is an important piece of knowledge, which it is critical for you to understand. There will be numerous questions about this 11-year march to independence. I want to turn to the subject of ordinary folks and the American Revolution. And I want to begin with what the outline refers to as a shoemaker's revolution and the repudiation of deference. Talked a bit about this yesterday when I said that the repudiation of deference was an important agent of change that was transforming 18th century American culture and society. And I talked about the person of George Robert Twelfthewes. I want to talk some more about him and his story. Remember, Twelfthewes was the poor shoemaker in Boston. And I used an episode from his life to illustrate the idea and practice of deference. I also suggested that Twelfthewes' participation in the Revolution, both in some of the great events leading to the War of Independence, and then his participation as both a militiaman and as a privateer during the war itself, freed him, liberated him from this acceptance that gentlemen were better than ordinary men, and that by nature, gentlemen were entitled to lead and govern and to tell everyone else, including ordinary freemen, what they should be thinking and doing. Twelfthewes, by his own account, was one of the quote unquote Indians who participated in the Boston Tea Party. He, along with fellow Boston patriots, had boarded the English ships laden with tea and had thrown all the tea overboard. That night, something happened that forever changed his life. As he related the story to the two New York City newspapermen, he said that while he was topside on the English tea ship, disguised as an indigenous person, he had a hatchet in his hand, which he was using to smash open the chests of tea so that the contents could be thrown overboard into the harbor. And he said that as he raised his hatchet to smash into a tea chest, he said there was another patriot, also disguised as an indigenous person, who was standing on the other side. And he said he looked at the man, and even though, again, he was in disguise, he recognized him. And 12 Hughes told the two New York City newspapermen that he was sure that it was John Hancock, the richest man in town, the man who had commissioned a pair of shoes from 12 Hughes, the man who had invited 12 Hughes to come to his house on New Year's Day, probably in the year 1764 or 1765. And 12 Hughes said that as he recognized the man, that it was an epiphany. It was a sort of road to Damascus experience. He said, as he recognized Hancock and thought about the fact that here was the richest man in town who was standing next to him, both acting as patriots on behalf of America. 12 Hughes said that he vowed to himself that he would never stand tongue-tied before a gentleman again, that he would never acknowledge that some men were better than he, that he would participate further in the War of Independence. And when the war was over and he had survived, he saw himself as a new man. He was a free man. He was a citizen of the American Republic. And even though he was poor, and he would essentially spend the rest of his long life living in rather humble circumstances, that even as a poor man, he was equal, and he was as good as any man. I think this experience speaks to the impact that the Revolution and the War of Independence had on a lot of ordinary white men, that there was a kind of leveling experience, which many such individuals learned, and that lesson learned was equality. And it was based on a complete repudiation of the principle and practice of deference. Let me turn to the second group whose American revolutionary experience I wish to address, and that is women. And I want to use the person of Abigail Adams as kind of a stand-in for women, and that's always dangerous. But I think that there are some general facts that we can discern here, which I think are relevant to a lot of women in revolutionary America. Abigail Adams was the wife of John Adams, the great patriot from Massachusetts. John Adams was part of the committee, along with Thomas Jefferson, that would write the Declaration of Independence. John Adams became the first vice president of the United States, and then he succeeded George Washington as president. His wife, Abigail, was terribly interested in politics, even though by law and by cultural tradition, for the most part, she was relegated to a sort of back seat in just how much she could participate in American politics. But she had a very keen political mind. She probably was her husband John's most trusted advisor. In March and April of 1776, as her husband John was going off to the Second Continental Congress, where he and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and a couple other men would form a committee to draft an American Declaration of Independence, she wrote a long letter to her husband John, a two-part letter. And in part, this is what the letter said. Remember, she's writing to her husband, John, who has gone to Philadelphia to participate in the Second Continental Congress. She wrote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency." In other words, she's saying, John, I know you're going to Philadelphia to declare American independence. And she says, do it, right on. "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies. I desire you would remember the ladies. Be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, to start a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Remember how the men had opposed the Stamp Act, for instance, by crying no taxation without representation? She is arguing that if men had that right, women had that right too. What is so astounding about this is that ideas about liberty and personal independence and self-government, government based on the people, government that must at all times be accountable and answerable to the people, this had become like the air that all Americans were breathing. And all Americans, including Abigail Adams and other American women, were breathing in the air of liberty and personal independence and popular self-government. The third group that I want to talk about, African American slaves, and the stand-in for all slaves is the person of Gabriel Prosser, who was an African American slave who belonged to a plantation owner near Richmond, Virginia. By the time of the War of Independence and in the first years that followed, slavery was widely viewed in Virginia as a dying institution. The rural economy of Virginia was being transformed, was moving away from tobacco in the direction of growing corn and wheat and raising livestock. And this transformation in the economy had created a surplus slave population. Virginia now had many more slaves than it could put to work. As a consequence, slavery became more casual than it had been. Many slaves, like Gabriel Prosser, who was a blacksmith, was allowed to hire out his own services to any white man who would contract for those services. He still had to give most of the money he earned to his rightful owner, but he did keep some of the money. Perhaps more importantly, Gabriel Prosser was able to live and work with poor whites and other slaves who were in the same situation that he was. And during the course of these experiences, he came up with an idea. And that idea was that the War of Independence had ended before the American Revolution was really over. The war, the revolution, as far as it had gone, gave political rights to ordinary white men, mostly to ordinary white men who owned their own farms. Prosser reasoned that the ideals of the revolution, that all men are created equal, that those ideals had not yet been fully implemented. So Prosser came up with the idea of leading a rebellion. It would be a slave uprising in part. Yes, slavery had to end, but it would also be a rebellion that aimed at completing the work of the American Revolution. And that meant giving political rights not only to poor, landless whites, but of course also freeing the slaves and giving them political rights. Prosser's rebellion never happened. There was an elaborate plan for it, but word leaked out, and the rebellion was suppressed before it had even begun. Many individuals, including Gabriel Prosser, would be rounded up and arrested and executed. One of Gabriel Prosser's chief lieutenants, a fellow slave who would help to plan the rebellion, as he was standing on the gallows facing hanging and execution, he was asked, and the white authorities who had suppressed the rebellion again before it even started had been encouraging those slaves who had been apprehended to confess and to give names of other slaves and maybe even other poor whites who had been involved. This is how this rebel responded. I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer. So he's comparing himself to George Washington. He's saying, I'm a patriot of the American Revolution and the War of Independence. I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial by them. In other words, if General Washington during the war had been captured and the British had tried to interrogate him and get the names of perhaps his leading officers, that no one expected that George Washington would have given any information to his British captors. The slave continued, I have adventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and I am a willing sacrifice in their cause. And I beg as a favor that I may be immediately led to execution. I know that you have predetermined to shed my blood. Why then all this mockery of a trial? The ideals, the principles of the American Revolution were in the air. And everyone, even slaves, were breathing the air of ideas about liberty and personal independence and self-government. Um, I think the important uh, takeaway here is that the revolution was not limited in its impact, far from it. The revolution was not limited in its impact to just the George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons and Alexander Hamiltons of America. There was a significant popular underside to the event we call the American Revolution. The next group that I want to talk about are ordinary farmers, which made up these independent rural households, made up the majority of the people of 18th century America. I want to use a North Carolina farmer named Herman Husband as a stand-in for all farmers at this time. Husband is going to lead a group of small non-slaveholding farmers in North Carolina who called themselves regulators. The term regulator and regulation referred to the idea which Americans were embracing, that government must be based on the people, that the people are sovereign, that all government officials should be seen as the agents and trustees of the people. They were all answerable and accountable to the people. And these regulators, and this is going to be a rebellion in the North Carolina backcountry that takes place even before the War of Independence. These regulators, these small non-slaveholding North Carolina farmers, rebelled against the North Carolina colonial government, which was run and controlled by wealthy slaveholders, plantation owners. And these small non-slaveholders, these regulators had come to the conclusion that the government was corrupt, that the government was a tool of the rich and wealthy, that the government did not do right by ordinary small farmers. What Husband told his regulator followers, these small non-slaveholding farmers, he told them, show yourselves to be free men. Show yourselves to be free men. What he was calling upon them to do was to reject and repudiate deference, to no longer accept government of, by, and for the wealthy. He was calling upon ordinary men to exercise personal independence and autonomy, to be the boss of their own affairs, to think and act on their own behalf, to show that they were ready to live without the leave or permission of any other man. So here again with small farmers, I think we see the importance of the repudiation of deference, this kind of leveling political, legal, and social equality that is embraced by ordinary white men. Finally, I also want to mention Indigenous people, Native Americans, and here the person who I will offer as a stand-in is Pontiac, who would lead a rebellion against British authority following the end of the French and Indian War in 1762. Pontiac would organize and mobilize many groups of indigenous people in the Great Lakes region. He called upon them to drive out the white man, to drive out Anglo-Americans, to make war on them. What Pontiac had recognized was that there was a fundamental conflict, uh, social, cultural, political conflict between indigenous people and Anglo-Americans. Pontiac called upon uh, his people and his followers to reject Anglo-American ways, to reject their material goods and their technology. Part of the fundamental conflict had to do with understanding land. For indigenous people, land was their mother. It was something that could be used, but not owned. So the idea that Anglo-Americans brought with them, the concept of private property, that land could be bought and sold, and it could be privately owned. All of this was utterly uh, uh, strange and incomprehensible to indigenous people. So Pontiac, I think, was calling for a revival and a renaissance of indigenous culture. And in an interesting way, I think Native Americans are sharing in the spirit of personal liberty and independence and self-government that were the core principles of the revolution and the War of Independence. So did ordinary people share in and participate in the American Revolution? I think the answer is emphatically yes. Finally, I want to turn to the fight for independence. I'm not a military historian. We could spend lectures on a careful analysis of the War of Independence, its military and social features. I'm not going to do that. But I do want to talk about how the British, with all the advantages that they had going into the War of Independence, how the British ultimately could not suppress the American Revolution. Let's assess the respective strengths of the British and the Americans as the War of Independence began. British advantages, population of 11 million, which was much larger than the American population of 2.5 million. The British had an experienced professional army, 48,000 soldiers. They would also hire 30,000 German mercenaries to help fight the war in America. The Royal Navy was the most powerful navy in Western Europe. The Royal Navy at the time had at least 139 ships of the line. These were the equivalent of aircraft carriers and battleships in the American Navy during the 20th century. British weaknesses. Because America was a predominantly rural culture and society, the American population was spread out over vast distances from the main frontier to Georgia. And by the time of the War of Independence, Anglo-American settlers were crossing the Appalachian Mountains into the heartland of North America. The task, the objective, which the British confronted was literally to subdue a continent. In other words, yes, there were some American cities, places like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, but since the great majority of the American population lived in the countryside, The Brits could occupy an American city, but that did not really bring the British any closer to suppressing the American rebellion. In other words, America had no strategic centers. So it was not simply a matter of, well, if we occupy New York City or take control of Philadelphia, that will end the contest. American advantages? Well, first, something called rage militaire, and I'm not sure I included that word in the outline for today, so I will get out an addendum where I will include that word. What I mean by rage militaire, it's a French phrase. Americans in the beginning, when the war breaks out, even when the insurgency erupts in 1774, and then the following year with the battles of Lexington and Concord and Breeds and Bunker Hill, Americans possessed great confidence and enthusiasm that they would succeed in their struggle for American independence and self-government. Americans would place a lot of confidence in citizen soldiers, while the British would fight the war with regular professional soldiers. Americans were wary of standing armies, of professional soldiers. They'd had a bad experience with the buildup of British troops in places like Boston and New York. They had confidence that all citizens, and most citizens at this time were farmers, that during a time of national emergency, that farmers would leave their farms. They would come and become active in the militia, and they would fight. They would fight for American freedom. And even though these citizen soldiers were not professional soldiers, again, Americans had great confidence that free men fighting for their independence would make up a formidable fighting force. Americans also would, of course, fight a defensive war. Fighting a defensive war always brings with it certain strategic advantages. You know the ground. It is sometimes said that men fight harder when they are fighting to protect their homes and families. American weaknesses? Well, even as the war begins in earnest, probably no more than 30% of Americans were active patriots. So the great majority of Americans throughout much of the war were neutral. They were kind of sitting on the fence. They were holding their finger in the wind to see which side was going to win. It certainly turns out to be a disadvantage, even though Americans were counting it as something that would help them. Fighting the war with citizen soldiers could not go head to head and toe to toe with professional soldiers. And after the first year of the war, George Washington's Continental Army was made up of some of the poorest and most desperate men in America. In other words, in the first year, there were a lot of middle-class sorts of farmers who would join the army. But after the first year, the only soldiers left in Washington's Continental Army were very poor men who were there to get a meal, who were there to earn the few dollars per month that they were paid, and they would soon learn that they wouldn't even get the few dollars per month that were due them. Let me talk a little bit about British strategy and why the British were ultimately unsuccessful in suppressing the American rebellion, even though they had some very big material advantages operating in their favor. The first British strategy was to look at the American problem as a problem of lawbreaking and disorder in America. Remember how Parliament had responded to the Boston Tea Party. They cracked down with the coercive acts. The coercive acts were the motivation, the objective was, the justification was that there were troublemakers apparently in Boston, Massachusetts, that were responsible for stirring up matters, and that if only these troublemakers could be arrested and prosecuted and convicted and punished, that Britain's American troubles could be resolved. Well, certainly the outbreak of the insurrection in the summer of 1774, and then the first battles of the War of Independence at Lexington and Concord, and then at Breed's and Bunker Hill in July of 1775. The British realized that the American rebellion here involved more than just a few lawbreakers, that Britain had a real war, a real insurrection / rebellion on its hands. And the British would take their army from Boston. They would move down to New York City. General William Howe takes command. And Howe is going to prosecute a classic European-style war against George Washington's Continental Army. In other words, Howe is going to try to engage Washington's Continental Army in a major battle. Howe was confident that the expertise and professionalism of his army would always prevail over George Washington's army of amateurs, of citizen soldiers. And he believed that if he could draw Washington's army into one of these classic European-style battles, that Washington's army would be destroyed, and that would bring an end to the American Rebellion. So for several years, from roughly 1776 up through 1777 or so, General Howe chases Washington's army around New Jersey and Pennsylvania, trying to engage Washington again in one of these pitched battles. But Washington was too smart to take the bait. Washington knew that his army would be defeated in such a confrontation with Howe. And so he's going to pursue a strategy, a kind of guerrilla warfare. Washington is going to be careful to choose the ground on which he wished to fight. He would strike and then repeat, but he would avoid the kind of pitched battle that General Howe was looking for. And this turned out to be a brilliant strategy. Washington loses most of the battles he fights, but he wins the war. He wins the war of attrition, like what happened to America in Vietnam. America was not militarily defeated in Vietnam, but the American people, the American government lost the will to fight. Because of the way that George Washington fights, again, avoiding a classic pitched battle, Washington will win the war of attrition. In the end, the British give up. The British decide that suppressing the American rebellion was too hard, and the British lost the will to do so. The third and last strategy that the British Army will employ against Americans is something that begins around 1779, 1780. The British decide that they will take the war into the southern colonies, into the Carolinas. Why take the war into the Carolinas? Well, the British were aware of American slavery. They believe that if they took the war into the South, that they could practice a policy of divide and conquer, They could turn slaves against their masters. They were aware of what had happened with the North Carolina regulators a few years before, that they could turn small backcountry farmers against the ruling plantation elite. So this strategy of divide and conquer was entered into with great hope and great anticipation of a final British victory. And it gets off to a good start. Lord Cornwallis takes his army, captures Charleston. He captured and routed another American army at the Battle of Camden. But then Cornwallis, his initiative bogs down. Americans again begin to use a guerrilla strategy. They win a couple of victories at Kings Mountain and at the Battle of Cowpens, and Cornwallis eventually retreated. He took his army back to Virginia, back to Yorktown, Virginia. There he was awaiting the British Navy to come and rescue him. But instead, the French Navy showed up. The French had become our political and military allies. So the French Navy blocked Cornwallis's escape. Meanwhile, George Washington slipped down from Pennsylvania to lay siege to Cornwallis's army. And in October of 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. And that was the end to the real fighting. It would be another 2 years before the Treaty of Paris acknowledged American independence. Let me end here by saying that it was probably serendipitous. It was good fortune and providence that the war ended when it did, because Washington's American Continental Army was falling apart. There were going to be major mutinies in 1780, 1781. Pennsylvania and New Jersey troops mutiny. They even turned their guns against their own officers. And then at the very end of the war, in the very year of the Treaty of Paris, an event took place known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. The Army, the Continental Army, had gone into disbandment at Newburgh, New York, which is not far from the present-day site of the military academy at West Point. The officers this time were very unhappy. They were very dissatisfied. They had been promised a lot if they would stay in the field and keep fighting until victory was won. But they didn't trust the promises that the Continental Congress had made to them. And we know that some of the officers, not including George Washington, he had gone back to Mount Vernon, but some of Washington's senior officers began to talk about a mutiny, began to talk about a military coup d'etat. In other words, a military takeover of the American government. We'll never know exactly how close the country may have come to such a coup d'etat. But when George Washington learned about what was happening with his army, he returned to the army. And I think this was George Washington's finest moment. He could have had anything he wanted from his army. If he had been an American Napoleon, if he had been a Julius Caesar, and he had told his army, yes, the civilian government has made a mess of things, we're going to take over and we're going to make things right, I think we might well have had a military government established in America in 1783, 1784, and George Washington may have become King George I of America. But in the end, Washington would have no part of this. He pleaded and argued with his officers, and in the end, because of the great prestige that he had with not only the enlisted men, but with the officers as well, he was able to diffuse this threat of mutiny and coup d'etat. See you next time.